Good morning, friends. Today we come to the last element listed in the fruit of the Spirit, self-control. Self-control, perhaps more than any of the other qualities listed here, is most rejected by the society we live in. Because to control oneself by nature means to deny oneself in some capacity, to have an impulse and yet control the impulse and not act according to it. But we live in a society that says that denying your impulses is basically doing violence to yourself, and that is in turn considered a great evil. But friends, as we'll see in a minute, self-control is not doing violence to yourself. Rather, it's preserving yourself from that which really will destroy you. But before we get to that, let's go to 2 Timothy 1, verse 7, and let's witness a fascinating link between the meekness that we looked at yesterday and the self-control we have today. Paul's writing to the young pastor named Timothy, and Timothy apparently struggles with anxiety and being timid. So Paul writes to him saying, "For God gave us a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and self-control." We talked yesterday about the fact that being meek does not mean being weak. But where those two things are connected is in the fact that just like in any other thing, you can take a good thing to an extreme and all of a sudden it's not good anymore. For instance, you can take all the examples of the apostles proclaiming the gospel boldly in the book of Acts, and you can adopt that for yourself and say, I'm going to preach and speak boldly. But you can take it to an extreme such that you're not just preaching boldly, but you're preaching and teaching arrogantly, demandingly, and without compassion. On the other end of that spectrum, you take the teaching of meekness, and you can go to the extreme of timidness and fear, as apparently Timothy was struggling with. But Paul makes it clear here that we are called to speak boldly, but not arrogantly, meekly, but not fearfully either. Rather, God has given us a spirit of power and love and self-control. Self-control is what keeps us between those two sinful extremes, acting instead in the proper position of righteousness. When Paul teaches another pastor, a man named Titus, in Titus chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, he writes, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age." Notice how you have ungodliness and worldly passions on the one side, both of which are destructive and lead to death for yourself. And on the other side, you have uprightness. Do you remember that from a couple days ago when we talked about goodness? You have uprightness and godliness, which lead to life and joy and blessedness on the other side. And what's in the middle? Self-control. We have to be in control of ourselves to keep us focused on that which is actually beneficial and good, the godly things of God, rather than the worldly passions that would otherwise run rampant in our lives. And this is what our society most hates, because self-control again requires the denial of those natural impulses. But the world refuses to admit that those natural impulses could be anything other than virtuous in their own right. The world demands that we self-actualize, that we self-fulfill, not that we self-deny. But the difference is their refusal to admit that we are by nature sinful and self-destructive beings. That the reason we have wars and crime and hatred is because people will not deny their natural impulses, which are in fact sinful. But self-control is the warden who protects the gate to only let in the good and beneficial things. In fact, the book of Proverbs says it a little bit differently and much more effectively in Proverbs 25:28, where we read, "A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls." Self-control is the wall that protects us from the besieging enemy that would destroy us utterly if given the chance. And again, we just look at our society right now and we see that, yes, there are absolutely injustices that need to be dealt with, evils that must be corrected. But how much more evil and chaos has been added to the mix with nothing fixed, added to the mix because of a demand to obey immediate impulse rather than consider any semblance of self-control. Friends, we are to renounce ungodliness. We are to say no to sin, to evil. We are to control ourselves in all ways. And to clarify, self-control does not mean self-law. It does not mean living by self-standards. No, we control ourselves according to God's law, God's standards. It is His righteousness that we long for and look for, and that we know will actually lead to good things. And my favorite illustration of this is how the author of Psalm 119 is constantly making statements like what he does in verse 10, where he writes, "With my whole heart I seek you, let me not wander from your commandments." The psalmist declares that with his whole heart he wants to seek God. That's his purpose. That's his standard. God is his standard. He's orienting and controlling his life toward that goal. But he also knows the reality of the situation, that in his own power he is weak and he can't accomplish it. So Lord, let me not wander from your commandments. This is the kind of self-control, and if I might add, self-awareness that we need to display. To say, I love you, Lord. I orient my life by your word. I will say no to sin and yes to your righteousness. I want to be self-controlled in this way. But Lord, I need you to give me self-control. Help me. By your Spirit, grant me power to control these sinful impulses and to not just affirm righteousness, but to live, think, say, and do what is right. May that be all of our prayer today. Have a good and godly day, and if the Lord wills, I'll see you tomorrow.